Welcome to A Dram of Outlander. This is Desiree, your podcaster and the writer for adramofOutlander.com. For all things Outlander, from the Die in a Gabaldon book series to the Stars TV series and anything interesting that falls between. This is podcast episode 176, and we're installment 12 of the Fiery Cross read-along. Hello! I hope you are faring very well today. It is indeed summer and hot and sweltering out there for all of us in the northern hemisphere, and I hope those of you in the southern hemisphere who are listening are enjoying your cooler days right now. But I actually love summer. It's a favorite, and it brings me incredible joy. There's just some combinations of summer days that make it difficult. And being in my podcasting booth in the basement of my house is the most wonderful place to be because the temperature stays somewhere in the mid-60s all the time. So that is a thrilling pursuit. So we are at the Ridge. It's fall and life is bustling. All those people came back to settle at the Ridge, but there's not enough space. There aren't enough cabins built. So the big house is overflowing with people, okay? And there's going to be some nerves over that. It's not always going to be pretty for anybody. Poor baby Jemmy is teething. We're trying to figure out all the things out and where everybody's supposed to go, on top of Jemmy having to prepare a militia because that was the deal for getting all those acres of land and becoming his own landowner laird again. But it does come with some complication. So we're looking at chapters 21 and 22, and 21 is 2020. And 22 is the Fiery Cross. And the summary goes something like this. Claire administers an eye examination. Mrs. Bug takes ownership of the big house. A family with a sordid past comes to visit. Claire worries. Claire struggles with the changes to come. Fight, fight, fight! Solace is found in the outdoors. Jemmy ceremonially prepares for the changes ahead. The men Jemmy calls to arms must come of their own volition. So these two chapters really give us a sense of life on the Ridge, okay? What's going on? It adds texture to the story. It creates that reality of everyday life. And we've seen a lot of those chapters since coming back from the gathering. And imagine what it would be like to have like a giant family reunion and everybody's trying to fit into your house, or they're camping in your backyard, etc. Like everybody's double bunking, and it's really challenging to get everybody integrated. And part of the issue with that is all parents don't have the same parenting styles. This is not a new phenomenon, that now that we have social media, we can see other people's parenting styles in your face and be aggravated by them. It's where you just have to learn how to live with other people. And it's difficult. It's not a new phenomenon. People have raised their children differently than other people, or that you would, since the beginning of time, since they were babies, okay? I wonder if that happens in the animal world, if the animal world gets mad at other animals, other animal mamas, especially the mamas, for raising their children not according to plan. I don't know. It's sort of a silly thought. Oh, and on that note, I have to say I'm going to interject a little bit of show into this. Adso kitten. Oh my goodness. If you have not seen Kitty Adso, Outlander Stars has posted pictures on their Facebook page and on Instagram. I've posted pictures as well I love all the animals of Outlander. When I'm hiking, I actually greet people's animals and I don't say hello to them sometimes. Sorry, it's the introvert in me. I'm social, but I prefer animals and small children. So if I'm at a party and I'm not comfortable, I will go sit with their dog or with the small kids. I will go check on them. And it's pretty funny. So anyway, you need to go see the pictures of baby Adso. I'm dying how cute that cat is. I want to steal that kitty. And I know that Ginger from Outlander Pod wants to steal that kitty too. So cute. All the lovely. All right. So let me get back to this story. Okay. And Adso is in this chapter because Adso sleeps in Claire's surgery because it's too crowded everywhere else. Okay, so I listed things that are going on that I think have some kind of importance to the movement of this story. Did I cover everything? No. But first off, the reason this chapter is called 2020 is because Claire performs an eye examination on Dear Roger because Roger's shooting ability is so abysmal. And unlike his wife and father-in-law, who can shoot anything, whether it's moving or not, poor Roger cannot. So we are finding yet another skill that Roger not only lacks, but because of his vision, he's never going to be able to shoot a moving target accurately. So, he's not going to go hunting for animals. So, Roger doesn't have binocular vision, and I did put a link in the written part of it. Basically, his eyes do not work together to form a 3D picture. It's not totally uncommon. There are lots of people who are like that. And as Claire puts it, Roger has eyes like a hawk because they also don't have binocular vision. So his brain, because he didn't wear the glasses as a child, and Claire did tell him it probably would have been too late by the time he started wearing the glasses. It has to be caught before the age of 5 because of how the brain wires and hardwires. So he would have to close his one eye to shoot something that wasn't moving in order to be accurate. And Claire tried is like, it's fine. And there's a section in here that I think is really interesting. This is where the richness of Diana's writing comes in, where she takes a very simple thing like Claire checking Roger's eyes and doing an eye chart and all of that. And she has a candle and she brought it to check the dilation of his pupils. And she thinks while she's inspecting him, his eyes were the most lovely color. I thought not hazel at all, but a very clear dark green, dark enough to look almost black in shadow, but a startling color, almost emerald, when seen directly in bright light. A disconcerting sight to one who had known Galis Duncan and seen her mad humor and laugh out of those clear green depths. He blinked once, involuntarily, long black lashes sweeping down over them, and the memory disappeared. These eyes were beautiful, but calm, and above all, sane. I smiled at him, and he smiled back in reflex, not understanding. I passed the candle before his face, up, down, right, left, asking him to keep looking at the flame, watching the changes as his eyes moved to and fro. Since no answers were required in this exercise, he began to relax a bit, his fists gradually uncurling on his thighs. So we get to see Claire's humor there, and that inner working that require more effort on the TV show. So she continues, and this is where she explains exactly what's going on. And Roger did have a pair of special glasses, but he wouldn't wear them when he was a kid. So there you have it. Interesting for Claire to wonder what Roger really has from Galus. There's so much that is simply genetic about us. I mean, nurture has a lot to do with it, but dang, nature is pretty impressive. It's crazy when you look at, even when you don't see somebody in your family and you meet them and they have the same voice inflection and the same physical mannerisms, or you've never met them before, like siblings who are separated at a young age, or they don't even know that the siblings exist, and they meet as adults, and it's shocking when they laugh the same. There's a lot to do with our genetics that make who we are, and then the nurture runs away with us, doesn't it? But really what this scene comes down to is he's not going to be a hunter. And at first he's really aggravated by it. And Claire's like, gets all offended because she's like, what? You don't think I put food on this table? I put food on this table every day without shooting anything. And she does. She's the gardener. She's the herbalist. She, might take care of the chickens. And so there's a lot that Roger can actually do to contribute. And she's trying to stop him from going into that idea that I can't do anything, right? And the other really cute part of this is where she says to him, you can see perfectly well for almost anything you want to do. And you very likely can learn to shoot all right. Most of the men I see shooting close one eye when they fire anyway. But you might have trouble hitting moving targets. You can see what you're aiming at all right, but without binocular vision, you may not be able to tell precisely where it is in order to hit it. I see. So if it comes to a fight, I'd best rely on straightforward bashing, is that it? In my humble experience of Scottish conflicts, I said, most fights amount to no more than bashing anyway. You only use a gun or arrow if your goal is murder. And in that case, a blade is usually the weapon of preference. So much surer, Jamie tells me. Very cute. So we get to see their relationship dynamic and Roger's wit, because he's very smart and quick. And so they can banter with each other in a way that he may not be able to banter with somebody else. It's really, I like their relationship. I think it's really, really sweet. But Roger's bottom line, what it ends up coming to this conversation that's always in the back of his mind is this genetic? So, if Jemmy has it, this means he's his child. But Claire cannot give him a definitive answer on that. I think it's interesting that Claire can actually perform a complete eye examination. I mean, medical school was not specialized like it is now when she would have been in medical school. So she would have learned the whole overarching view of family medicine, right? Before she went and did her specialty in surgery. But surgery was, and a few other specialties were out there. But really, it's not like it is today where somebody would go into emergency medicine, or they would go into dermatology, or they would go into urology. They would go into a specialty. And so even though they learn those skills along the way, it's not something that they would perform on any regular basis, if at all, in their special area of expertise. So, interesting. So, who knows? But also, I'm pretty sure that Claire has the kind of memory that she never forgets anything she reads. Like, there are some actors that have that, where they literally see it, never forget it. Some people hear it, they never forget it, and some people have a photographic memory. So it's really fascinating that a small percentage of people never forget anything someone tells them, never forgets anything they read. That is astounding. And I really do think that Claire is that kind of person where she simply ingests information and it sticks. She's not one to, I don't think, ever forget much. I don't recall a case in the books where she's forgotten anything of ever. If you have memory of her forgetting something, that sounds really funny, let me know. It's 719-425-9444 for the voicemail line, and contact@adramavoutlander.com if you want to send an email. Or you can always message me through the Facebook group or page, or on Twitter or Instagram as well. Okay. I'm curious because I can't really remember. So that's a very short chapter, but it had some interesting things in it. So chapter 22 is the fiery cross. This is a long chapter. So the first thing I put for this is Mrs. Bug is in her element cooking and caring for Jamie, Claire, and those staying at the Ridge or in the big house. People come to the big house for breakfast. Well, now you have to remember with all these extra people who don't have their own cabins yet, they're going to go to the big house, and the people staying in there will also be eating there. So she's just doing her thing. And the men got up early to leave, and they just took bread with them and milk and didn't wake Mrs. Bug to make him a proper breakfast, and she's quite miffed over it. But she really runs a tight ship. She reminds me of a rougher Mrs. Fitz, like where she's a little bit more demanding than Miss Fitz. But she runs a tight ship. The difference is Mrs. Fitz, I think, was good at being a purveyor, like looking at all the things that they had and what they were going to need and balancing everything out. And that she would not run out of supplies. And Mrs. Bug, I'm not sure that even though she's great at the hospitality, she's great at the cooking, she's great at the cleaning and the organization, she may not be so great at limiting or rationing certain things, as we see going forward. So the Muellers arrive, and they end up staying at Brianna and Roger's cabin, a whole bunch of Muellers. And having them at the Ridge is challenging, since Gerhard is the one who scalped the local Tuscarora, including Nayawenne, who he thought cursed his family with the measles. That's when his daughter and granddaughter died. So he's got a reputation, and Jamie needs his help there. He's there in Jamie's invitation. So what are you going to do? It's a really difficult situation. He believed he was taking care of his family, and it's a brutality that in Gerhard's mind had a purpose, and it's so different than we could imagine ever doing things today, that this is a circumstance that I think most of us find challenging when we're trying to view it through their timing, their era, the culture. And so not only do you have the time in the colonies, pre-American Revolutionary War, the Muellers are immigrants. So then you have to take into account his German European upbringing and culture as well. It's very complex. Yes, there are reasons why we have certain laws on the books, because they have to transcend culture and we have to have some kind of order, right? But at the time, the individual colonies had their own laws because, they turned into their own states with their own state constitutions, but they had their own laws and governance under the crown. But there are some pretty slim pickings for the troops that were there from England or from Great Britain. And they pretty much ran themselves. And in that particular colony, this is not something that Gerhard Mueller was going to get arrested for. But this really troubles Brianna. This really troubles Marcelly. And Jamie's like, what am I supposed to do about it? Like, what do you want me to do? Because if you retaliate, then it's going to escalate, and it becomes this horrible thing. And it becomes worse, and there's more bloodshed. There really isn't a good answer for the situation. And while these things were going on, there's a lot of dynamic going on between personalities and this view into this kind of one day, this one morning to afternoon that we're seeing. And we find that Claire was doing careful math of all the food stores to ensure Mrs. Bug isn't being too elaborate with the feeding of everyone. Again, she might be good at lots of things, but she may not be good at part of the administration of it. And we also see that Claire cleverly hides the special foods that she doesn't want anybody getting into. Little fingers of kids and the stuff she doesn't want to run out of because it's very limited supply. So she's going over all the stores. The other thing that she gets really concerned with, looking at all the different things that they have available, are that how is she going to fight the vitamin deficiencies that can come up in winter when you're not eating fruits and vegetables in their regular forms that you get in the summer. Now, they do a lot of drying and a lot of canning, but they don't have the technology then to freeze things, right? Here's what she sees when she's looking at the stores. Besides 6 hams in the smoke shed, there were 4 sides of bacon and half another, plus a rack of dried venison and half of a relatively recent carcass. Looking up, I could see the low roof beams, black with soot and thick with clusters of smoked dried fish, split and bound stiffly in bunches, like the petals of large ugly flowers. There were 10 casks of salt fish as well, and 4 of salt pork, a stone crock of lard, a smaller one of fine leaf lard, another of head cheese. So she's trying to size it up. I don't know about you, but my pantry looks nothing like that. And there are other things that they have in store: sacks of rice and dried beans, bushels of hickory nuts, butternuts, black walnuts, dried squash, a bag of oatmeal and cornmeal, lots of apple cider and cider vinegar, salted butter, goat cheeses, blackberries and wild currants. So they have all these things either dried or being dried or preserved. And so I would love actually for my pantry to look a lot more like Claire's than it does like mine, where everything's in jars or cans, like regular cans like we have now. I'm not drying a bunch of food, but those things are very salty. So they have to make sure that they're getting enough water too. That'd be and to cook with those dried foods that are salted is really difficult. I mean, it's going to add flavor if everything else is plain, but it's definitely challenging, and I would dare say it would get pretty boring at the end of winter when all their stocks are low. Are any of you herbalists or big gardeners or farmers and ranchers where you are going to have more of these on hand, or fishermen, fisherwomen? I think that's pretty awesome. One of my longest enduring memories from when I was 8 years old and I was visiting my mother in Northern California where she lived, and the neighbor girl that I played with in the summer when I came to visit, she was 3 years older than me, but we got along quite well. Her dad and brothers had gone catfishing, and their yard was huge. This was a neighborhood of old Victorian homes, and so they had these narrower yards, but they were very long. And from the front of the fence to the very back fence, there was a string put up, like almost like a laundry line, maybe 80 feet. I cannot tell you how many fish they caught. I do remember going into the backyard on a 95-degree day, and they were gutting all these fish. I mean, I cannot believe how many they caught. I know that they were freezing a bunch for themselves, but they had to have been selling some of them to butchers or whatever, because back then you could still do that. I cannot imagine how many there were, because there was probably one every 6 inches. There was a catfish. And I helped. It was really interesting. Besides this nasty stench from it being a hot day, I mean, the work had to be done quickly. And so when I went over to the house, I was like, sure, I'll help. So there you go. You get your knife and you gut those things. It was really fascinating. But I even think with a deep freezer, I don't even know how they would put that many fish in there. I seriously don't know. It's such a crazy memory. But I remember walking into the yard thinking, I'd never seen so many fish at one time, ever. And I don't think I've ever seen a concentration of fish like that in somebody's backyard or a haul that somebody had that's just a normal person, not a fisherman for trade. It was so interesting. The dad also hunted, though, too. So they had game and other things throughout the year. So they lived more similarly to this than we do now, for certain. So the next point I put in here is Claire's botched penicillin experiment and a catfight between Mrs. Bug and Mrs. Chisolm until Brianna breaks it up. But before that happens, Brianna and Claire notice this giant cross when the men return in the courtyard. And Brianna's like, new religion? Like what? And the reason it takes both of their breaths away is because the Ku Klux Klan that started in the South and was all over the South and still is, would burn crosses. And I was looking at the history of the Ku Klux Klan yesterday, and I couldn't really find where it said that it was started by Scots, Irish, those who have clan connection, but they likely got the word clan from kind of the clan connection of Scots and Irish. And it's a tough one. I just could find the regular history. I didn't find any of that stuff. But I also will tell you I didn't dig very deep. It is a topic that is challenging, to be sure, to look at. And I remember even when I was a child, the horror stories that would still come out of the South from the members, what things that they would do to those who weren't Caucasians, to African Americans. It was terrible. And it makes me like physically ill to even think about it, and to say their name, it just is horrifying to me. But that's why Claire and Brianna both took pause, because that's what they know. That stuff was at a height of horror when Brianna was growing up in America. Well, in the U.S. Okay. So then what ends up happening is there's this huge catfight between Mrs. Chisolm and Mrs. Bug. But Mrs. Bug, before that, had been in Claire's surgery cleaning it because some of the boys got in there. And Claire gets so angry and flips out. Goes to her surgery. And sure enough, it is spick and span spotless. Uh-oh. So Claire had started a penicillin experiment to try and see if she could get the right mold to make penicillin out of. And Mrs. Bug threw away those nasty pieces of bread. But this is interesting because this is where Claire's like, rah, right? She's all mad. You mess with my stuff. Leave me alone. I think part of what's going on here is Claire's really an introvert and she's really struggling with all the chaos. But the other part of it is that Claire, in a very self-aware way, is like, why am I so mad about this? Like, my reaction is really obnoxious in comparison to what Mrs. Bug did. And her reaction was born out of her yearning for the predictability of home, hearth, and her surgery. This is a theme of Claire's since the first book, when she sees that vase. And she's never had a home to have a vase in because of her upbringing. And though she loves to travel and she doesn't mind sleeping rough and all of those things because of her upbringing, it also causes that yearning in her to be just settled. Even though Claire and Jemmy are terrible about being settled, they both have that wanderlust and they get swept up into things. But that yearning and that desire for just a little piece of just calm, protected home, routine is really important to her. And so her starting that experiment was the normalcy, was just fed into the desire for the normalcy because they're going to have to leave because there's a standoff coming up, right? They're going to have to leave with the militia and Claire's not staying there. She would never have been able to complete that experiment anyway. So she's like, there's always time to start it again. And she came to that thing of, I've had plenty of experiments that failed or were destroyed, and it's fine. I will just do another one. But she had to recognize, and her self-awareness, I think, we're seeing it grow. And we're seeing her be able to have that emotional intelligence to connect to herself. Where at other times she'll do things and you're like, is she even paying attention to what's happening? Is she not listening to herself? Does she have any idea what's really going on inside of her head? So that's what's going on with Claire. She's trying to hold on to a little bit of that peace, knowing that things are going to be changing. And it's okay that they're doing it. It's the fact that it's disrupting her fantasy. What happened right here? So then there's this massive fighting going on between Mrs. Chisolm and Mrs. Bug. And then Brianna had a very bad night because the baby's teething, and then the Muellers show up, so she doesn't get any sleep at all, okay? So she's super grumpy. So you can't think of Sophie Skelton. This scene is never going to happen. Brianna is big. Brianna, okay, see, Katrina Balfe is 5'11", but she's very finely built. She has a petite build. She's simply tall. Well, Brianna in the book, or in the books, is like 6 foot tall, 6'1", and she's built like Jemmy. She doesn't have a lot of grace. She's thicker. I mean, so you have to imagine her. She's not wafy at all. Now, Brianna's not like what you would say would be fat or overweight. She's just big. We all know those people who are built thicker. They have thicker shoulders. They have thicker legs. That's just how they're built. And that's how Brianna's built. She is definitely not built like a waif. And so she's this tall, sturdy, strong woman. And Roger is 6'3" in the books, and Jamie's 6'4". So Sam is real close, so is Richard Rankin. But, I mean, you have to think about this. She's kind of a bull in a china shop. She's not graceful. She's just, sort of like, I would say she's probably more like Gwendolyn Christie from Game of Thrones, who played Brienne of Tarth, my favorite. Where Brienne is trim and she's fit, but she's not built small. She's not wafy. at all. Nobody would call her that. She's not small-boned. And I think of Brianna as being built like her. Awesome, gorgeous build. Just not petite. So, in this scene, I'm just going to read it because it's so great. Mrs. Bug's shrill cries behind me were suddenly silenced, and I whirled round again to see Brianna, who had evidently run round the house, coming through the kitchen, holding the diminutive Mrs. Bug well off the floor, one arm round her middle, the other hand firmly pressed across her mouth. Mrs. Bug's tiny feet kicked wildly, her eyes bulging above the muffling hand. Bree rolled her eyes at me and retreated through the kitchen door, carrying her captive. Mrs. Bug is like 4'10" or something. She's this teeny tiny little, I picture her being plumper, but very short and tiny. I turned round to deal with Mrs. Chisolm, only to see the flick of her homespun gray skirt disappearing hastily round the corner of the doorstep, a child's wail receding like a distant siren. The broom lay at my feet. I picked it up and went into the surgery and shut the door behind me. That scene is so funny. Like, there's no way that Sophie Skelton's going to be able to do that to anyone. But I think it's quite hilarious. So it makes me wonder if Roger is going to do it, if they shoot that scene at all. It is just one of those really funny, endearing scenes, again, that just shows the dynamic of the home life. And sometimes you just got to take matters into your own hands and fix it. It does remind us that Brianna is like Jamie's daughter, and she's just going to fix it if it needs to be fixed. So everyone present is at their wits' end with the overcrowded spaces and rowdy children. Brianna snaps. Yes, she did. Claire decidedly finds the male folk easier to be around than a bunch of women. And she's actually thinking she's looking forward to sleeping rough and going to the standoff with the militia, because she's like, oh my goodness, I get to be in the company of men and no children screaming, and it's not crowded, and I'll sleep on the ground. She doesn't even care. She's sleeping on the ground. She's like, she doesn't need creature comforts. She just needs space, and she's looking forward to it. Because it's like her sleeping out with her Uncle Lamb and his, manservant. So it's interesting how this all works out. And so Brianna is just exhausted. And Jemmy's whining, and Claire was going to kind of snap at her. And then she looks at Brianna and says, go sleep in my room. I'll take the baby. So she takes Jemmy and she starts walking. And she goes out and she's like, I'm going to go to the whiskey clearing. So she's going to go to where the malting shed is that they have, because she wants to get a little whiskey to put on his gums, because she's like, okay, everything's got to simmer down here. But the further away she gets from the big house, she starts relaxing. Jemmy stops whining and complaining as much. And the echoes of Nayawenne visit her as she walks with Jemmy. Because she starts wondering about what spirit animal will Jemmy get. And Jamie's the bear, right? And young Ian is the wolf. And she thinks of this because there's a raven that flies past. And one raven means change, two means abundance, I think is what it says. And she's like, okay, a Highland superstition, that's fine. But then she remembers that Nayawenne told her that the raven is her spirit animal, is her guide. but that animal chose you. And so she's wondering what it might be and how it might play out. And Claire, because this is Claire and she's actually very funny, is she wondered at the time what one was supposed to do if chosen by something ignominious like a shrew or a dung beetle, but was too polite to ask. This is her upbringing with her uncle, and her not having a lot of cultural things pressed upon her to be a young lady. And so she probably would have been able to ask her uncle that when she was 6 years old, 7, 8 years old, 9 years old, whatever. But it's not polite to really ask other people, and she's learned that over the years. But she still thinks it, which I think is fantastic. So I wonder what Jemmy will be, what we'll find maybe in one of the next books as well. I think mine must be goat. I love goats, and I think it's because, which I know it's not a goat, it's because I don't climb rocks and stuff. I'm not a rock climber. But when I was a premature baby at the hospital, I rejected the formula and I wasn't growing well. So they went to a local farm and got raw goat's milk and brought it into the hospital to give to me. So I do have a deep love and affiliation with goats. I just don't have goat-like attributes. So Claire goes to the malting shed, and there's always one small cask and nothing's there. She can't find anything. She's just wondering where it went. She looked into the clearing. Nothing is there hidden either. So she starts to head back with Jemmy. He's a little more contented now. But she's a little like, oh, okay, disappointed that she couldn't find it, of course. So, after having unsuccessfully visiting the malting shed to find some soothing whiskey for Jemmy's sore gums, she happens upon Jemmy bathing by the spring, or in the spring. And she stops to simply watch him. I stopped dead, hidden by a scrubby growth of evergreen. It wasn't his state of undress that halted me, but rather something in the look of him. He looked tired, but that was only reasonable since he had been up and gone so early. The ragged breeks he wore for riding lay puddled on the ground nearby, his belt and its impedimenta neatly coiled beside them. My eye caught a dark blotch of color half hidden in the grass beyond, the blue and brown cloth of his hunting kilt. As I watched, he pulled the shirt over his head and dropped it, then knelt down naked by the spring and splashed water over his arms and face. His clothes were mud-streaked from riding, but he wasn't filthy by any means. A simple hand and face wash would have sufficed, I thought, and could have been accomplished in much greater comfort by the kitchen hearth. He stood up, though, and taking the small bucket from the edge of the spring, scooped up cold water and poured it deliberately over himself, closing his eyes and gritting his teeth as it streamed down his chest and legs. I could see his balls draw up tight against his body, looking for shelter as the icy water sluiced through the auburn bush of his pubic hair and dripped off his cock. Claire's very observant, isn't she? And she says to Jemmy, "Your grandfather has lost his bloody mind." I knew Jemmy wasn't totally impervious to cold. I could see him gasp and shudder from where I stood in the shelter of the rock, and I shivered in sympathy. A Highlander born and bred, he simply didn't regard cold, hunger, or general discomfort as anything to take account of. Even so, this seemed to be taking cleanliness to an extreme. He took a deep, gasping breath and poured water over himself a second time. When he bent to scoop up the third bucketful, it began to dawn on me what he was doing. A surgeon scrubs before operating for the sake of cleanliness, of course, but that isn't all there is to it. The ritual of soaping the hands, scrubbing the nails, rinsing the skin, repeated and repeated to the point of pain, is as much a mental activity as a physical one. The act of washing oneself in this obsessive way serves to focus the mind and prepare the spirit. One is washing away external preoccupation, sloughing petty distraction, just as surely as one scrubs away germs and dead skin. I had done it often enough to recognize this particular ritual when I saw it. Jemmy was not merely washing, he was cleaning himself, using the cold water not only as a solvent but as a mortification. He was preparing himself for something, and the notion made a small cold trickle run down my own spine, chilly as the spring water. And then she observes the next step in his ritual. The light streamed through the leafless trees bright enough that from where I stood I could see him now only in silhouette, like glowing through the damp linen of his shirt, the darkness of his body, a shadow within. He stood with his head lifted, shoulders up, a man listening. And then I froze, not moving at all, trying not to breathe, and like a rabbit under a bush to become part of the wood around me. Jemmy's pulse beat blue, a tender vein across his temple, and I bent my head over it to hide it. Jemmy said something aloud in Gaelic. It sounded like a challenge or perhaps a greeting. The words seemed vaguely familiar, but there was no one there. The clearing was empty. The air felt suddenly colder, as though the light had dimmed, a cloud crossing the face of the sun, I thought, and looked up. But there were no clouds. The sky was clear. Jemmy moved suddenly, my arms startled, and I clutched him tighter, willing him to make no sound. And this is where the ritual moves forward. Jemmy washed, and then he paused, and he made a statement. And then he took his dirk from its discarded sheath and with no hesitation drew the edge across the fingers of his right hand. I could see the thin dark line across his fingertips and bit my lips. He waited a moment for the blood to well up, then shook his hand with a sudden hard flick of the wrist, so that droplets of blood flew from his fingers and struck the standing stone at the head of the pool. He laid the dirk beneath the stone and crossed himself with blood-streaked fingers of his right hand. He knelt then very slowly and bowed his head over folded hands. I'd seen him pray now and then, of course, but always in public, or at least with the knowledge that I was there. Now he plainly thought himself alone, and to watch him kneeling so, stained with blood and his soul given over, made me feel that I spied on an act more private than any intimacy of the body. I would have moved or spoken, and yet to interrupt seemed a sort of desecration. I kept silent, but found I was no longer a spectator. My own mind had turned to prayer unintended. O Lord, the words formed themselves in my mind without conscious thought. I commend to you the soul of your servant James. Help him, please. Then he crossed himself and rose, and time started again. Without my having noticed, it had stopped. Goodness, that scene is gorgeous. It's gorgeous. Everyone take a breath. I got endorphins and oxytocin while reading that passage to you. Those paragraphs. So amazing. Have you had those experiences when you come into something going on and you stop and you know it's something special? You know there's something spiritual going on. You become part of that bubble and you stay there. Time stops when I catch a baby. At the point of birth, it's like the universe exhales and it just pauses. until the baby integrates into the world, and then everything starts up again. It's amazing to be in that bubble, and it feels so intimate. It's just not the act of a brand new human coming out of a human body, right, of a human mother. There's something about that new person breaking the silence, the new person speaking into the world for the first time. I can't really put it into words, but it is something that is so transcendent of the physical earth. I mean, it's definitely a spiritual occurrence. It's just gives me the chills thinking about it. But so she saw that, and she knew that's where everything stills. You don't hear the birds, you don't hear any animals, you don't pay attention to anything else that's going on around. It just cocoons out. Like you don't even recognize that it exists, and you enter this space. And because she was observing him, she entered that space with him. And yes, it is very intimate to see this kind of event take place in front of you. After Jamie's prayer reached its conclusion, Claire and Jemmy joined him. Of course, Jamie had a flask of the holy water, whisky, to soothe Jemmy's sore gums. Jamie explains the calling of the clans for war, which is interesting here. There's a deep understanding that he is not clan chief or laird of the peoples on the ridge or in the back country. The men must come by free will. Jamie walks a fine line of loyalist who will have to turn traitor. And the most fascinating part of this is that Claire thought he was praying. He was seeking connection with his Uncle Dougal because he was the one who was the war chieftain, right, for the Mackenzies. And he was asking his uncle to help him. And this is like really kind of stunned Claire for a second, but he was calling upon him when he was in the act of prayer. Here's what Jamie had to say about it. But to gather the clan for war, all the fighting men, that was a rarer thing. I only saw it the once myself, but it's no sight you would forget. The cross of pine wood had been there when he woke one morning at the castle, surprising him as he crossed the courtyard. The inhabitants of Leach were up and about their business as usual, but no one glanced at the cross or referred to it in any way. Even so, there were undercurrents of excitement running through the castle. The men stood there in knots, talking in undertones, but when he joined the group, the talk shifted at once to desultory conversation. I was Colum's nephew, but newly come to the castle, and they kent my sire and grandsire. Jamie's paternal grandmother had been Simon Lord Lovat, chief of the Frasers of Lovat, and no great friend of the Mackenzies of Leach. I couldn't tell what was afoot, but something was. The hair in my arms prickled whenever I caught someone's eye. At last he had made his way to the stable and found old Alec, Colum's master of horse. The old man had been fond of Ella Mackenzie and was kind to the son for his mother's sake as well as his own. "'Tis the fiery cross, lad," he told Jamie, tossing him a currycomb and jerking his head toward the stalls. "You'll not ha' seen it before." It was old, he'd said, one of the ways that had been followed for hundreds of years, no one quite knowing where it had started, who had done it first or why. "When a Hieland chief will call his men to war," the old man had said, deftly running his gnarled hand through a knotted mane. "He has a cross made and sets it afire. It's put out at once, Ken, with blood or with water. But still it's called the fiery cross, and it will be carried through the glens and corries, assigned to the men of the clan to fetch their weapons and come to the gathering place prepared for battle." "Aye," Jamie had said, feeling excitement hollow his belly. "And who do we fight then? Where do we ride? The old man Grizzle's brow had crinkled in amused approval at that we. You follow where your chieftain leads you, lad, but tonight it will be the grants we go against. So that's the symbolism behind the cross. He had seen Dougal do it, and this was his way of preparing and calling people to what was to come, to the militia, to go to the fight. Okay? And then when he goes on to explain the difference in what he is doing, because Jemmy is such a deep thinker. He's very good at strategy, but he's very good at people and understanding people and the psychology of people, I think. Because he recognizes that unlike Dougal, who were calling the people on the Mackenzie lands to go to fight with the Mackenzies, those people had an obligation to do that. We saw that at the gathering of the clans by Colum when he was asking for their renewed fealty, right? Their oaths that they would swear to him. And so those men had to go when called. All these men that Jamie's calling, well, Roger, I guess, would need to come. But who else? Who else among them would have to come? Not one. Maybe Fergus. Okay, so 2. But what can Fergus really do? One-handed. So these are men who are free to choose. These are men that are not Jamie's. And so he's trying to create a bonding experience. He's trying to call them in a ritualistic, ceremonial way that will create the following and for the desire for them to trust him and follow him, even though he's not their war chieftain. He's not their laird. He's not the head of their house, So it's really difficult what he has to do. And he has to trust these men, and they have to trust him. And what foundation do they have? These acres? Their cottages or cabins? Some of the men, sure, because of Ardsmuir, but how many of these people, as it starts to add more, they don't know what he's made of. Not really. They don't know how trustworthy and loyal he is. They don't know that it's a core component of what makes him a human is to protect people, right? To look after people and to do the right thing. So this is a big ask, and it's a big risk, because the other part of it is, this is a backcountry militia. This isn't even like somebody going and joining the military on their own regard and following orders. So this is a different animal, and he has to create the environment in which to bring people together so they will follow him, to create a brotherhood, right? And a bond. And this is the beginning of that, because it's a powerful image. It's a powerful symbolism to have them come along. And Jamie also knows that building this in is going to be helpful in the future, because at some point they're going to have to jump ship and play for the colonies and turn their back on the crown, because the American Revolution is coming. The whispers of it are in the air, and this confrontation that's coming up is some sort of beginning of that. It's growing. It's festering. It's building. Revolution is, those just the faintest sounds of it are in the air. They're in the trees, right? And Jamie knows that he has to have these people on his side in order to do that. And what's interesting to this conversation is that Claire asks why. Why will you do it? Do you not see? One eyebrow lifted as he turned his head to me. You told me what would happen at Culloden, and I believed you, Sassenach, fearful as it was. The men of Lallybroch came home safe as much because of you as because of me. That was not entirely true. Any man who had marched to Nairn with the Highland army would have known that disaster lay somewhere ahead still. I had been able to help in some small way to make sure that Lallybroch was prepared, not only for the battle, but its aftermath. The small weight of guilt that I always felt when I thought of the rising lifted slightly, easing my heart. Well, perhaps, but what? You have told to me what will happen here, Sassenach. You and Brianna and Mackenzie, all three. Rebellion and war, and this time, victory. Victory, I nodded numbly, remembering what I knew of wars and the cost of victory. It was, however, better than defeat. Well then, he stooped to pick up his dirk and gestured with it to the mountains around us. I have sworn an oath to the crown. If I break it in the time of war, I am a traitor. My land is forfeit and my life, and those who follow me will share my fate. True? True? I swallowed, hugging my arms tight around me, wishing I still held Jemmy. Jamie turned to face me, his eyes hard and bright. But the crown will not prevail this time, you've told me. And if the king is overthrown, what then of my oath? If I've kept it, then I'm traitor to the rebel cause. You see, at some point, Tryon and the king will lose their power over me. But I dinna ken when that may be. At some point, the rebels will hold power, but I dinna ken when that may be. And in between, he tilted the point of his dirk downward. I do see a very tidy little cleft stick. To follow Tryon's orders now was plainly the only choice. Later, however, for Jamie to continue as the governor's man into the early stages of the revolution was to declare himself a loyalist, which would be fatal in the long run. In the short run, though, to break with Tryon, forswear his oath to the king and declare for the rebels, that would cost him his land and quite possibly his life. He shrugged, with the wry twist of the mouth, and sat back a little, easing Jemmy on his lap. Well, it's no as though I've never found myself walking between two fires before, Sassenach. I may come out of it a bit scorched around the edges, but I dinna think I'll fry. It's in my blood, no? So they were able to have some humor in this, and his grandfather is brought up. And the thing about old Simon is that in the end, old Simon could have blamed it on his son. But instead, old Simon went and had his head cut off as a traitor. And, of course, I hope it doesn't turn out this way, right? So he's been very introspective about this whole thing, obviously. And Claire, though she knows it's coming until they have these conversations, her introspection lies elsewhere oftentimes. She's not thinking of this like a chessboard, and Jamie's got this chessboard set up and he's looking at every single move on every side. I think the game of chess is really valuable in life if you have to ever do politics or you're a strategist. Like, I don't think you can actually function well unless you do those things. So really, Jamie finishes getting dressed. And at this point is when Claire finds out that he called upon Dougal. And this really surprised Claire. And Jamie tells her, I made my peace with Dougal long ago. He said softly, seeing the direction of my glance. He touched the hilt of the knife with its knurl of gold that had once been Hector Cameron's. He was a chieftain, Dougal. He will know that I did then as I must, for my men, for you, and that I will now do it again. I realize now what it was he had said, standing tall, facing the west, the direction to which the souls of the dead fly home. It had neither been prayer nor plea. I knew the words, though. It was many years since I'd heard them. He shouted, "To la garde," the war cry of the clan Mackenzie. I swallowed hard. And will he help you, do you think? He nodded serious. "If it can," he said. "He will have fought together many times." Dougal and I, hand to hand, and back to back. And after all, Sassenach, blood is blood. And that's the end of the chapter. So this is where we're seeing lots of those little strings get tied up. Of course, there had to be some guilt for Jemmy killing his uncle. But the fact that he could go back to his uncle in the spirit and say, "I need your help. Come and be with me. Be at my back." And believe that the spirit of Dougal will be there and will guide him and give him support that he needs. It's a way of thinking where I'm pretty sure I've covered in the podcast, where today there seems to be this loss of ability to have something happen and it ever be repairable, and you ever find peace with it, or you ever stop blaming, or even having a conversation on two sides of an issue. It's like the art of conversation, the art of understanding what honor, what duty, what loyalty means, and what that looks like in action in life is lost. It's as if we've gone mad, and people jump to conclusions, and they jump on bandwagons, and they do these things, and they can't ever quite find that reconciliation. And it would be like if you don't like somebody because of something they did to you or something that they do in life, and you have no ability to see any positive gains about them. I think it's the very rare individual that is 100% bad or 100% good, if they exist at all. And somehow, I think, yes, that Dougal would have been able to understand why Jemmy killed him, why it was necessary to save Claire. That was it. It was one or the other. One of them was going to die. And though Dougal didn't want to be the one to die, he certainly would have nodded his head to the victor and said, "Well done." Because one of them had to go. They could not be in the same space anymore. And I do think that Dougal would have given him that nod, because he would know why Jemmy did it. Just like Jemmy understood why Dougal tried to, wanted to kill Claire. Hence try and kill Jemmy. I think that people have lost the insight to seeing the layers and the subtleties in situations and the perspectives. And I think it's really imperative that we step into other people's shoes to understand why they think how they think. It's all bright and nice to be in groups and situations where you just feel safe, and there's a whole safe space thing right now, which actually bothers me quite a lot. This world is a very difficult and unsafe space. The whole world. Hopefully inside, behind your door, it's a safe space. I hope that for you. I hope you have good friends that are loyal and trustworthy. I hope you have love and kindness surrounding you. But the world at large, the world in small, is not safe. And people need to know how to deal with varying situations and circumstances. But I think we really need to stop being offended by everything, and we need to sit there and ask the questions. Be a 3-year-old. Ask all the questions. See it from somebody else's vantage point. You don't have to agree with it. You don't have to like it. Heck, you can hate it. But dehumanizing other people is the simplest way to be able to cause harm to other people, to allow harm to other people. And keeping them human is sometimes the hardest thing, because then you need to forgive and you need to see them as frail humans, as humans who make mistakes, as humans who think their own way. And I think we've lost that a lot. We're all imperfect. All of us have struggles. Every one of us. And there are people that I am dear friends with who we have, drastically opposing political views for our own very good reasons. We have very different views on religion. We have different belief systems in some ways. And that's fine. And guess what? We can still like and love each other without having to be the same. And to be able to differentiate between work obligation, personal things, X, Y, and Z. Yeah, some things do come above others. And that's the point of Jemmy being like, blood is blood, man. He's still going to be here for me, hand to hand, back to back, fighting with me and helping. Because that's what we do. You don't have to, get along with your sibling. But when it comes down to it, whether it's an adopted sibling or a step sibling or a sibling, if you guys are a family, that's it. Family's family. You fight together. You fight off the demons together if you can. And it's really important. And I so understand that Dougal would be like, totally didn't want to be the dead one. Totally thought I should kill her. But I would have killed you because you were defending her. You had to kill me or she would be dead, or you would too. Like, he would have understood it even though he didn't like it. And in today's world, like, that spirit would just be like, I'm going to hold a grudge forever and never understand. I'm never forgiving you. I'm never going to see beyond it. I'm not helping you from the afterlife. Whatever your views on the afterlife are. I have a feeling if you like Outlander, you may have some, if not religious beliefs of some kind, agnostic beliefs. Maybe not. It's possible. It's a good story, but there's a lot of spirituality and religion in here. So that ends this episode. And if you have questions, comments, etc., 719-425-9444 or contact@adramofOutlander.com. Facebook is a Dram of Outlander page or the A Dram of Outlander group. Please join. It's a really great group. We are very active, and Jan and Patricia are awesome moderators / admins, and they help out keeping the flow going with conversation. Twitter and Instagram, it is Dram of Outlander without the A in the front. And season 5 is filming, and we saw pictures from a site that somehow gets a hold of pictures all the time. And it looks like Claire's having a flashback into the 60s or before. Not sure what the year is because we don't know. It's not official. Still waiting for casting news and pictures and all of that. So hopefully we'll be getting some of that soon. But I hope you have a fantastic week. And you will hear from me soon. And until next time, Slán Java.